Just out of curiosity, how many of us here are developers or come from a dev background? And how many of you guys come from IT or operations? Oh, this is nice. Good. Anybody here from QA? Like one poor guy's like. That's awesome. Let me see here if I can get my screen up. So good, then I can equal opportunity bash both dev and ops. This is great. All right, let me do a display. So how many of you guys, by any chance, I moved to Central Oregon not too long ago, and how many of you guys have ever used an impact hammer drill? Anybody? So does this right here look familiar to you guys? This can change your world. This with like I used to call it a star bit. No, I'm sorry, Dave. It's called a Torx bit. All right, so with a Torx bit, you know, with like those little deck screws, it's great. You just point it at something and it does all the work for you. And that's the reason why I bring that up is because when we talk about like the common predictors of IT performance, I used to think the tool doesn't matter. I used to actually say that. Just like I could put together my deck, you know, by hand, right, with the screwdriver, the hard way. But in fact, the tool does matter. I know I've been involved in probably about a dozen Agile transformations in my history, and maybe you have too. And when we were working in certain tools I'm not going to mention, and even Visual Studio 2012 and previous, it was god-awful. I'm just going to be frank. Having your developers, you know, manually select these things, and now it's Kanban board driven, right? It's easy. When I found that my devs could just update their status in 30 seconds or less every day, that's when our Agile transformation took off. So you notice right there with these 7 predictors of IT performance, how many of them have to do with tools? Well, looks like about 5 of them are tool-based. So in fact, tools do matter, just like the impact hammer drill. But what I've seen in the outcome I want from this talk for you guys is those of you guys who are devs, and also maybe the IT people too, almost immediately you're going to start thinking, what's the best tool? You might go down the Ansible route, or Chef, or Puppet, or Microsoft, right, with Release Manager. And that almost always is the wrong instinct, because inevitably it's not the tools that limit you as much, because they're all interoperable to an extent. They all have pluses and minuses, but they're all very capable. I'm not going to bash on any of them. The best part, though, where problems usually happen with a DevOps transformation, it always comes down to people. Process sometimes, but usually people. So the outcome from this talk is to talk about when you go back to your organization next Monday, you're going to be all excited about a lot of great speakers, and you're going to have some great solutions, but it will all be for nothing if you can't build a sensible roadmap that works for your company. So Phoenix Project style, we're going to do 2 sample conversions. One a train wreck, absolute cluster fire, all right? And the other one's going to be successful. And I'm hoping we can learn some lessons from the failure points of this one fictional company called Mustang, and then kind of apply it a little better with the win story. So I'm going to move past this. Yes, you can't buy DevOps. And if you bring in a consultant to do DevOps for you, it will not go well. I do believe in the importance of mentoring. I mean, that's what I do as a job. I'm a consultant. But DevOps must be seen as an internally led drive. And it must come from the top down. We're going to talk about how to get management buy-in with your drive. I love this quote right here from Gary Groover, who I owe a significant debt to him for some of the material in this talk. But he basically said the limiting factor for organizations is not the tool, it's their change management capacity. So let's take that into account with this company named Mustang and how they went about doing DevOps. They were very excited about this transformation. And they did it probably the way that you might be tempted to do it as well, or your executives. Wow, we keep on hearing great things about DevOps. It's the last mile of Agile. Let's get into it, you know? And so they start with a pilot team, And we're going to be doing DevOps the right way. Now, this pilot team, they have complete autonomy. They can choose their tooling. They can choose the software. They can choose the process that fits the way that they write their code. And guess what? It's a massive success, like you'd expect it to be. Suddenly they're producing releases every 3 weeks, not every 2 years. There's a lot less problems. The idea is, the plan is that eventually they're going to be taking this as a template, like a cookie cutter, and they're going to just roll it out to the other teams in the company. And that's how they're going to kind of make things happen. Well, what inevitably happens after that huge initial success, at month 6, they say, well, we're going to have this software we're going to buy. It's very expensive. And we don't just have 10 licenses now, we have 1,000. So it's a much higher ask, 7 figures. We're going to have to go in front of the CTO to get approval. So right away, your visibility within the organization, your level of risk is quite high because they're asking you some very pointed questions. About 9 months in, as you roll this out to different teams, you start immediately facing some problems. There's some tightly coupled software out there that's monolithic. It's not microservices based. And it's not adapting well to the DevOps world at all. Still, the releases are not really speeding up. You've invested about $2 million so far in DevOps coaches, right? Getting people excited. But these teams that you've rolled it out to did not choose the tool set. They didn't choose the flavor of DevOps that fits the way that they need to do work. So they have a hidden incentive, don't they, to cause this thing to fail. DevOps doesn't work for us. It isn't helping us. Because unlike that first team that was used as a template, they didn't have autonomy. They were given a recipe, an explicit recipe, and told to follow it. Well, almost right away, there's large amounts of resistance, and about a year in, there's significant frustration by the project managers and the business analysts because they were told, step aside, the devs are going to handle this now, right? And basically, the software is poorly integrated. It's poor release quality, significant production bugs. They spent about $5 million on it, and the CXO halts the DevOps reorg. He says, well, it's a good effort. It's a good idea for like the Amazons and Netflixes of the world, but not for us. DevOps doesn't work. So what caused this thing to fail so greatly? Well, first off, in the post-mortem they did, we should have they realized, a lot of text there, but really the old silos never really broke down. We needed to start with how to make our software easier to configure, to deploy, and to operate. That should have been the starting point. Instead, we went about doing DevOps just to do DevOps. It's a recipe for failure. In a way, you're pushing a rope. So at Microsoft, when we went about this transformation, if you were to go walk around Redmond, one of the few places on earth where you can actually find a Windows phone, by the way. It's pretty awesome. I use Google. People laughed at me 2 years ago, but now who's laughing? So there's another joke about that, but I'll get fired. So it's this right here is the definition that Donovan Brown came up with. He's our Microsoft DevOps guru. He said he spent 4 weeks coming up with this, which makes sense to me. It's very well put together, but it is a union of people, process, and tools to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. In this case, it's pushing bits, releasable bits, as fast as we can out the door without sacrificing quality. There's a lot of meaning there in that sentence, but I think the last part is most important, delivering business value. A lot of times when we meet with operations teams, they're worried, is this going to mean no ops? Is this going to mean I'm going to get handed a pink slip? When we meet with developers, they also have a lot of concerns. Does this mean that my production is going to slow down to a crawl? Because guess what? Developers are focused on change. We're focused on adding value, right? New features, cool new stuff. This is what we've always been about. That's change, but IT people and QA people are focused on quality. They're paid based on stability. Change and stability are different ends of the spectrum. So this nice little circle right here with a little kumbaya thing in the middle, that's nice on paper. It is very hard to get to work in practice, especially if you have a team of IT people, a team of QA people, a team of DBAs, and a team of developers. almost immediately you're going to have friction points. It's just human nature. And it becomes an us versus them game. Because our priorities, quite simply, are different. And you can't copy a template, a recipe, from one company and change it over to a different one. I know at Microsoft with our VSTS team, we flattened the org significantly. Nowadays, there's only 2 titles. You're either a program manager or you're an engineer. That's it. We had to change the way people sat. We forced people to come and work together in the same team. All that was necessary as a precondition for us to move away from multi-year releases to like every 3 weeks as we're doing currently. The reason why this copy and paste doesn't work is because for your organization, your pain point could be in one of 5 different places. It could be in your development side of things, especially if as a developer or as a business analyst, you're sitting on an aging inventory of requirements that are very heavily spec'd to the nth degree. This is not minimum releasable. This is like down to the very nitty-gritty details. That right there could be a pain point for you. And it'll require maybe some Agile training to move past that. We're seeing this less and less, thank goodness. Many companies are realizing that the pitfalls of waterfall. Another issue can be the procurement hassles across teams. For instance, there was times in my work where I was like, wow, we did so great on that one footwear application. I got it done in 2 sprints. That's 4 weeks. Aren't we great? Well, if you went to the business, they'd tell you Dave's team sucks. He in particular sucks, by the way. Why would they say that? I'm a likable guy. I mean, come on. It's because I thought I was done when work was out the door to QA. We're finished, right? But in fact, it was taking us several months to provision, procure, set up, and install the environments. And when that finally did happen, I was like, well, that's their problem. Wrong. The business viewed it as being our problem. It was a shared responsibility. So my work wasn't done in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. It was done in 3 months. And when I walked over to the IT person with my 10-page script of here's what you do, and by the way, it's never complete. There's always libraries I forgot to add, right? Was I making any friends with them? With those Friday night rollouts? No, they hated me. And they had a reason to hate me. So I was creating a lot of issues. The procurement across teams, it was mentioned, the previous speaker mentioned that. There's one company out there that tried doing Hello World and built it out. They were just trying to say, what's the length of time it takes to provision our environments? 250 days in, they just quit. How long would it take you to do that in Amazon or on Azure to spin up a set of VMs? 2 hours, half an hour, right? So yes, absolutely, you are competing, if the IT people in the room, with the cloud vendors out there. And that provisioning can be a definite pain point for your organization, especially when you have those siloed organizations where there's not the right priorities. Testing and fixing of defects, well, there, of course, that's usually the pain point where there's an issue with false positives. Our test harness isn't complete. Our automated tests are non-existent. We have a team of like 20 QA people in Bangalore that are testing, but it's a different time zone from us, so there's always a lag. Usually testing is oftentimes where we get the biggest bang for the buck, and it's also the biggest pain point. No company out there that I know of is entirely satisfied with how their test cycle's going. And then last, of course, we have variable environments. And when we do a release, dev never looks like QA, never looks like test, never looks like production. And even within QA, depending upon how load balancing is set, there could be all kinds of anomalies that cause us issues. So for every organization, your pain point is going to differ. I can't come in there as a consultant and say, follow this recipe, it's going to work. Because your values, your competition, your product line, and your pain point are going to vary so greatly. So moving on then to Appaloosa, this was a company, fictional, with a large existing code base. They had a very strong siloed teams, and the business said, well, we're not an IT company. You know, that's not what we do. You know, we're making tackle for horses, so come on. So they were drowning in technical debt. When they took a good look at things, they realized, well, manual testing is a significant effort. For us, it's taken us 3 or 4 weeks to complete one test cycle. This is forcing us into doing releases every 6 months, let's say, instead of every day or every week like we'd like. And although our Agile transformation has worked many times, we're causing a lot of angst with the QA team. Our devs are leaving QA and IT in the dust. And that can't work. We make horse tackle, right? We should all be harnessed together. So that's how, that very lucrative horse tackle market. So why did they start then with metrics? I mean, I've done this many places. The metrics you're going to gather make or break you because it tells you, here's where we're starting, here's where we want to go. It's exactly like losing weight. Why did they start with metrics? Borrowed this from Puppet. But they did a survey back in 2004, and I spent a lot of my time with pathological organizations, right? Ones that are very low-level cooperation, a lot of shooting in between teams, us versus them. That's just the reality of life. So there's 3 types of organizations: your pathological, your bureaucratic or rules-oriented ones, and then there's your transformative, your generative organizations. Microsoft is kind of a hybrid between the two, but don't tell anybody that, between a bureaucratic and generative, depending upon the team you're at. So it's a matter of how quickly you pivot. Really, it's how well the organization treats the outliers. At home, I've got about 24 chickens. And it's funny, you know, much like with people, one chicken is great. They've actually got a lot of personality. And they're delicious, by the way. But one chicken's fine, but you get more than one chicken, and they start behaving in very interesting ways, as you know. There's the peck, 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 and the fluffing and the scratching and the, kind of, beating the wings at each other. And we see those exact same things in organizations. People are what's going to make or break your DevOps transformation. So Appaloosa started with metrics because they realized, hey, we're actually very much a pathological organization. This is kind of where we're at. And you think about those 5 qualities there on the right-hand side, that's the 5 dysfunctions of a team. If you don't know those qualities, your manager does. Your manager has read this book. So if you look at your organization, you can kind of define for yourself, what's the condition of our topsoil here? Is our DevOps effort going to take off, or am I going to face significant resistance? So Appaloosa looked at themselves in the mirror and said, you know what? We have some challenges ahead of us. I'm not saying it can't be done, but this is not going to be an overnight thing. We're not as nimble as some of the larger companies out there. So that they came into it with a sense of reality. Learning from the mistakes of the Mustang disaster that happened, you'll see along their DevOps transformation, they said certain things. Well, let's see here. We don't have the budget or the business credibility for a major reorg. The business doesn't trust us anymore. But we have to change something. And they realize our biggest constraint is testing for us, for Appaloosa, right? If we had better release quality, our time to market could improve. And the leaders on the team said, we can't sell code quality to our business executives. They're just not going to buy it. They're going to say, that's not what we do here. But if we can package it with a monthly alignment to business goals, software features that the business says they must have, little by little, we can build up that relationship. We can get credibility. Many times I work fostering DevOps efforts with companies, and it's very common to see. It's almost a lot like marriage counseling. It really is. Like, but you have dev and IT teams, and they're practically at each other's throats. Who's right and who's wrong? At that point, like in marriage counseling, it doesn't matter. Where are we going to go? We need each other. This is a dysfunctional relationship where both sides feel hostage and held captive by the other. So how do we bridge a way out of this? How do we make a better path? That's what Appaloosa decided to do. Gradually, we'll get the credibility we need to get the funding for the tools, the fancy tools that we really want to install. So they decided our executives are going to set the strategic objectives for the enterprise 1 month at a time, which then are, instead of alienating your PM and your BA layer, we're going to bring them in and they're going to define that for our team. We're not going to work on anything as far as our technical debt. We're not going to try to drive that down until we're done with the business objectives for that sprint. And we're going to make sure those objectives are kept realistic. So let's move on. You notice here what they didn't do. They didn't just focus on, and this is key, just doing DevOps. They were focused on adding business value. There wasn't a single template for every team. Every team had autonomy to choose what they had to do as far as like code quality or reporting their progress. That was defined. There's a framework. That's not wrong. Shouldn't be chaos out there. But how they went about it was up to them. They had an Agile or a DevOps mentor working with them, but the team felt that the DevOps effort was their initiative. It wasn't upper management forcing this on them. They were held accountable to clear business goals. Testing came first for them. It was an iterative, low-risk approach because they didn't want to go in front of the CXO and put an $8 million quote on the table. So they did this over time, and they made sure that they didn't just cast aside your existing project manager or BA level. You didn't want to. That middle layer was very important for them. So those are some of the defects that they looked at. I'm limited on time, so let's just kind of move along. When they defined these pain points, they actually did this in a very scientific way. There's going to be a lot of text on the screen, so I mean, kind of ignore it, I guess, but those are the questions that they were asking, like, hey, what's the amount of time that we're spending shaping these requirements? If we were to actually do everything in our backlog, how many weeks would that take? You know, it ended up being quite some time. What about for our environments there? How long does it take us to provision an environment? Once we build them out, how many of them break or are brittle or require hand tweaking? Well, for that, of course, we look at infrastructure as code. What about our test harness? What's the length of time it takes for us to run a full cycle? What percentage of defects are we finding with this? How useful is it? And then lastly, we looked at our release and deployments. And they set some metrics here as far as like, what's the length of time it takes for us to recover from a bad build? How many production errors do we find? What category do they fall into? Is this because of the database? We must gather these metrics at the onset of doing any DevOps effort. And the reason why is because then you can actually show to your manager, here's the actual progress that we're making. In actual terms, managers love metrics. So for Appaloosa, they chose to focus on automated tests. Oftentimes, this is where you're going to start. You're going to want to roll out a lot of expensive new tools. There's companies out there that have literally thousands of very expensive automated tests out there. When it comes right down to it, though, they're brittle and relatively useless because they really didn't build it right. So what we recommend doing, oftentimes at Microsoft, is you start with your build acceptance tests. You build out a harness that's the bare minimum, saying, well, okay, I guess this website actually works. But the bare minimum that you need, and you get that continuous integration, continuous release pipeline going with gated acceptance tests like that. Again, bare minimum. Once that's going, you can look at this carefully, and you can say, okay, what's the number of errors that we're seeing that are false positives, that are because of our test layer, that aren't really issues, or that are issues relating to the environment? If it's relating to the environment, okay, so I guess we need to build in some tests following our builds to make sure that the environments that we provision are correct. But if you're finding a large number of coding issues, congratulations. That's what you want. Then you know your BATs, your build acceptance tests, are actually working. If you start from that standpoint and you kind of test and validate that very bare bones framework of testing, then you can augment that over time. And you'll come up with a test suite that is actually workable. So Appaloosa chose to focus on their automated test layer. Here's the KPIs that they chose to focus on and use. Every month, actually every sprint, they would release, here's what we're working on, here's our numbers. Never underestimate, especially for your management layer, the value of a dashboard showing the percent coverage of your unit tests, percent coverage of your functional tests. That's powerful stuff. Pretty soon you'll have guys coming by saying, how come our test coverage dropped this week? Well, we had to work on these new features. Well, I think you should spend some more time, shoring up our quality. So this is very effective, showing different KPIs like this. There's definitely other metrics you can use to collect, to determine this. And again, for this fictional company, over time, not all at once, they rolled out some tools that they found acceptable. So for source control, they use Visual Studio. For their testing, let's say you could go with Selenium, maybe MTM. Continuous integration, they chose to go with Release Manager. For their configuration management provisioning, they like Chef. They love the way that it could really make their environments consistent across the board. And for their dashboarding, they chose to go with New Relic. It's okay to mix and match. All of these tools have CLI. They all have command line interface. They're all meant to interrelate. So absolutely, there's a lot of tools out there you can use. None of them are wrong. As far as process improvements goes, you have this is basically how things worked over these 2 or 3 years, but they eventually got to where they needed to go. Again, it was by keeping the business goals first in mind. So I could keep on talking, but I think I'm out of time. There's a ton of material we could talk about. So I guess probably the takeaway for you guys is keep first things first. Once you start putting in those BATs, those acceptance tests, and you start getting a significant amount of resistance, you'll know it may not be an organization that's very friendly towards those changes. So it might be a good idea to step back from DevOps until you get that management commitment. Management commitment, it simply can't be done without top-down drive. I think as developers and as IT people, we have a lot of power, but you must get a consistent message across the organization. To do that, use numbers to your advantage. Identify where your company's pain point is and just hit that right on the head repeatedly with your messaging. So that's it. Is there any questions you guys have for me? Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.